Before the pyramids of Egypt rose to pierce the desert sky, before the pharaohs claimed dominion over the Nile, there existed a civilization so powerful, so advanced, that it would take archaeologists millennia to uncover its truth. This is not a tale whispered in the margins of history textbooks. This is not a footnote in someone else's empire. This is the story of Kerma, Africa's first kingdom, a superpower that vanished into sand and silence, erased so thoroughly that even its name was forgotten for 3,000 years. The desert keeps secrets. Beneath the scorching dunes of northern Sudan, beneath layers of wind-carved stone and sun-bleached earth, lie the remains of a civilization that once made empires tremble. For centuries, travelers passed through these barren lands, never knowing that beneath their feet rested the bones of Africa's oldest kingdom. The wind carried no stories, the sand revealed no monuments. History itself seemed to have conspired in the erasure, but the desert, patient and eternal, was merely waiting for the moment when humanity would be ready to confront a truth that shatters every narrative we were taught about civilization, about Africa, about the very origins of human greatness. If this story resonates with you, if you believe the real history deserves to be told, subscribe now, because we're uncovering the truths that were buried, forgotten, and deliberately erased from our collective memory. The year is approximately 2500 BCE, while Mesopotamia celebrates its city-states, and early dynastic Egypt consolidates power along the lower Nile. A different kind of civilization is emerging in Nubia, in the land that would become Kerma. This is not a society struggling to find its footing. This is not a culture merely surviving in the shadow of its northern neighbor. This is an independent, sophisticated kingdom, building the foundations of what would become one of ancient Africa's most formidable powers. The geography itself tells a story of strategic brilliance. Kerma rises at the third cataract of the Nile, a natural barrier where granite outcroppings break the river's smooth flow, creating a defensive position of extraordinary value. To the north lies Egypt, growing more ambitious with each passing dynasty. To the south stretches the African interior, rich with resources that would fuel empires: gold, ebony, ivory, incense, leopard skins, and exotic animals that northern kingdoms craved with a hunger that bordered on obsession. Kerma sits at the crossroads. Control this position, and you control the trade routes that connect the Mediterranean world to the heart of Africa. Control this position, and you dictate terms to everyone who wants access to the continent's wealth. The founders of Kerma understood this with a clarity that would define their civilization for the next 1,000 years. The earliest settlements are modest, villages of farmers and herders who have mastered the annual flood cycles of the Nile, who understand which crops thrive in the rich silt deposits, who know how to store grain against lean seasons. But even in these early centuries, something distinctive emerged. The pottery is not crude or utilitarian. It is elegant, thin-walled, burnished to a lustrous finish that catches sunlight like polished stone. The craftsmanship speaks of a culture that values beauty, that sees art not as luxury but as essential expression. The dead are buried with care and ceremony. Grave goods accompany them into the afterlife. Jewelry of shell and bone, weapons of copper and stone, vessels filled with food and drink for the journey ahead. This is not a society that views death as an ending. This is a culture with sophisticated beliefs about the continuity of existence, about the relationship between the living and the ancestors, about the sacred obligations that bind generations together. Trade networks extend in every direction. Merchants from Kerma travel south into the African interior, establishing relationships with communities that mine gold in distant hills, that hunt elephants in forests no Egyptian has ever seen, that harvest aromatic resins from trees that grow only in equatorial regions. These are not simple exchanges of goods. These are diplomatic missions, carefully negotiated partnerships built on trust, mutual benefit, and the recognition that prosperity flows from cooperation rather than conquest. To the north, contact with Egypt is inevitable. The relationship is complex from the beginning, part trade partnership, part rivalry, part cultural exchange that benefits both civilizations. Egyptian merchants arrive in Kerma seeking the exotic goods they cannot produce themselves. Kerma's traders travel to Egyptian cities, observing the temples and monuments, absorbing architectural ideas, learning administrative techniques, but never losing their own distinct identity. Because Kerma is not trying to become Egypt. Kerma is building something entirely its own. The early kingdom period, known to archaeologists as the Kerma Ancien, witnesses the construction of increasingly sophisticated structures. Circular dwellings give way to rectangular buildings with carefully planned layouts. Storage facilities are built to house the growing wealth flowing through the trade networks. Defensive walls begin to rise around the settlement's core, recognition that prosperity attracts not only merchants, but also those who would take by force what they cannot obtain through trade. Religious practices become more elaborate. A temple complex emerges near the heart of the settlement, a sacred space where priests perform rituals to ensure the Nile's annual flood, to guarantee successful harvests, to maintain cosmic order in a world that can shift from abundance to catastrophe with terrifying speed. The details of these ceremonies are lost to time, but archaeological evidence suggests practices that blend reverence for natural forces with ancestor veneration, creating a spiritual worldview uniquely suited to Kerma's position between the desert and the river, between the known and the unknown. Leadership structures evolve. The archaeological record shows burials that are distinctly different from the common graves, larger tumuli, more elaborate grave goods, evidence of ceremonies that drew hundreds or thousands of participants. These are the tombs of rulers, of individuals who commanded not just respect but something approaching worship, who embodied the kingdom's power and prosperity in their own persons. Political authority in Kerma is not simply inherited. It must be earned, demonstrated through successful leadership, through the ability to maintain trade relationships, through the wisdom to adjudicate disputes, through the courage to defend the kingdom against external threats. This creates a dynamic where rulers must constantly prove their worth, must balance the competing interests of merchants, priests, military leaders, and common citizens. It is a challenging model, but one that prevents the stagnation that comes when power flows automatically to the unworthy. As decades turn to centuries, Kerma transforms from a prosperous trading town into something far more significant, a regional power whose influence extends hundreds of miles in every direction. The period archaeologists designate as Kerma Moyen, the Middle Kingdom era, witnesses an explosion of growth, ambition, and cultural achievement that establishes Kerma as a civilization rivaling anything in the ancient world. The most visible symbol of this transformation is the Defufa, a massive mud brick structure that rises from the desert floor like a man-made mountain. This is not a pyramid, not an imitation of Egyptian architecture. This is something uniquely Kerma, a towering temple complex built from millions of sun-dried bricks, its walls sloping inward with mathematical precision, its interior chambers designed for rituals that only the initiated understand. The Western Defufa, as archaeologists would later name it, stands as testament to organizational capacity, to the ability to mobilize thousands of workers, to command resources on a scale that only true kingdoms achieve. The construction itself reveals sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. The mud brick technique, perfected over generations, creates structures remarkably resistant to the erosive forces that plague desert environments. The walls are thick enough to support multiple stories, the foundations deep enough to prevent settling, the overall design calculated to withstand not just years but millennia. The builders of the Defufa are thinking in terms of permanence, of creating monuments that will speak to future generations about Kerma's greatness long after the kingdom's name has been forgotten. Religious life centers increasingly on this massive complex. Priests maintain the sacred spaces, perform daily rituals, interpret omens, and serve as intermediaries between the human realm and the divine forces that govern existence. The priesthood becomes a powerful institution within the kingdom, accumulating wealth, knowledge, and political influence that sometimes rivals the royal authority itself. This creates a necessary balance. Rulers who depend on priests to legitimize their authority must also negotiate with them, must respect their prerogatives, and must recognize that spiritual power cannot be commanded through force alone. The city itself expands dramatically during this period. What was once a compact settlement surrounded by farmland now sprawls across the landscape. Residential neighborhoods develop distinct characters, wealthy merchant quarters with spacious compounds, artisan districts where specialized craftspeople produce goods for trade, working-class areas where farmers and laborers live in modest but comfortable dwellings. The urban planning shows clear intentionality. Streets follow logical patterns, water management systems, channel the Nile's bounty to where it is needed. Waste disposal is organized. This is not organic growth but deliberate city building informed by experience and intelligence. The marketplace becomes the beating heart of Kerma's economy. Here, merchants from across the known world gather to trade. Egyptian traders arrive with grain, linen, and manufactured goods. Kerma's own merchants return from expeditions south with gold dust, ivory tusks, ebony logs, leopard pelts, and live animals destined for royal menageries. The air fills with languages from a dozen different regions. The visual spectacle is intoxicating. Exotic goods piled high, skilled negotiators arguing prices, money changers calculating exchange rates between different systems of value, food vendors feeding the crowds that gather daily to participate in this commercial theater. Trade is more than economics in Kerma. It is diplomacy. Every transaction carries political implications. A favorable deal with an Egyptian merchant strengthens ties between kingdoms. A new trade route established with an interior African community expands Kerma's sphere of influence. The rulers of Kerma understand this instinctively. They cultivate relationships through trade, build alliances through commerce, and create dependencies that serve as insurance against military threats. Because military threats are constant in the ancient world. Egypt, unified under increasingly powerful pharaohs, looks southward with growing ambition. The resources flowing through Kerma, the gold especially, inflame Egyptian desire. Middle Kingdom Egypt, under the rulers of the 12th dynasty, begins to push its frontier south, constructing a chain of massive fortresses along the Nile, each one a statement of Egyptian power, each one a step closer to Kerma itself. The pharaohs of this era, Senusret I, Senusret II, Senusret III, are not content with passive trade relationships. They want control. They want to eliminate the middleman and access Africa's wealth directly. They want to reduce Kerma from an independent power to a tributary state, from a partner to a possession. The inscriptions they leave in their fortress temples speak of Nubians in terms that reveal Egyptian attitudes, describing them as enemies to be crushed, as barbarians to be civilized, as resources to be exploited. But Kerma is no helpless victim. The kingdom responds to Egyptian aggression with a sophisticated strategy that combines military resistance, diplomatic maneuvering, and economic leverage. Kerma's rulers understand that they cannot match Egypt's population or resources in straightforward military confrontation. What they can do is make any Egyptian conquest so costly, so difficult, so uncertain that the pharaohs decide the game is not worth the prize. The military forces of Kerma develop into formidable fighting units. Archers trained from childhood achieve accuracy that makes them deadly at ranges where Egyptian soldiers cannot respond effectively. Light infantry, unencumbered by heavy armor, move quickly through desert terrain that slows down Egyptian formations. Naval units patrol the Nile, interdicting Egyptian supply lines, raiding enemy positions under cover of darkness, disappearing into the landscape before reinforcements arrive. This is asymmetric warfare conducted with intelligence and ruthlessness. Simultaneously, Kerma's diplomats work to undermine Egyptian unity. They establish relationships with Egyptian nobles who resent pharaonic authority, with provincial governors who prefer profitable trade to costly military campaigns, with temple priesthoods who calculate that Kerma's exotic offerings better serve their interests than the pharaoh's demands for loyalty. The result is a web of competing interests that constrains Egyptian aggression, that creates factions within Egypt itself, that transforms what should be a simple conquest into a complex political problem. The economic weapon proves equally powerful. When Egypt becomes too aggressive, Kerma restricts trade. The exotic goods that Egyptian elites crave suddenly become scarce. Prices spike, nobles complain. Temple priests, deprived of incense and exotic animals for their ceremonies, pressure the pharaoh to restore trade relations. The message is clear. Kerma can inflict pain on Egypt without ever raising a sword. This is power of a different kind, subtler but no less effective than military might. The relationship between Kerma and Egypt during the Middle Kingdom era becomes one of history's most fascinating strategic competitions. Neither side can destroy the other. Neither side can afford to ignore the other. The result is a dynamic equilibrium, constantly tested, constantly renegotiated, constantly shaped by the personalities of individual rulers on both sides. Egyptian sources from this period provide glimpses into how the pharaohs viewed their southern neighbors. The execration texts, curious documents where Egyptians inscribed the names of enemies on pottery vessels, then ritually smashed them, include Kerma's rulers among those cursed. The symbolism is clear. Egypt wishes Kerma destroyed but resorts to magical rituals because military campaigns have proven frustratingly inconclusive. This is not the response of a dominant power easily subduing a weaker foe. This is the frustration of an empire that cannot impose its will despite obvious advantages. The fortresses Egypt constructed along the Nile during this period are among the most impressive military installations of the ancient world. Buhen, Semna, Kuma, Uranati. Each name marks a massive stone fortress with walls dozens of feet high, with carefully designed killing zones where attackers would be slaughtered by defenders raining down arrows and stones, with granaries sufficient to withstand years of siege. The archaeological remains of these fortresses reveal their scale and sophistication. They also reveal something else. Egypt felt it necessary to invest enormous resources in defense, which suggests that Kerma represented a genuine military threat, not merely a trading partner that sometimes required discipline. But Kerma does not merely react to Egyptian pressure. The kingdom continues its own expansion, extending influence southward into regions that Egyptians never penetrate, establishing satellite settlements that extend Kerma's trade networks deeper into the African interior. These outposts serve multiple functions. They are trading posts where merchants exchange goods, administrative centers where Kerma's authority is represented, and intelligence-gathering stations that provide early warning of threats or opportunities. The material culture of Kerma during this middle period achieves extraordinary sophistication. The pottery for which Kerma is most famous, eggshell-thin vessels with lustrous black tops and red bodies, achieved through carefully controlled firing techniques, becomes an art form that rivals any ceramic tradition in the ancient world. These vessels are not mass-produced utilitarian items. They are individual works of art, each one shaped by skilled hands, each one fired with precision that requires perfect understanding of kiln temperatures and oxygen levels, each one a statement that Kerma's craftspeople have mastered their materials with a completeness that transcends mere technical competence. Metalworking advances dramatically. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that requires both materials and the knowledge to combine them effectively, appears in increasing quantities. Kerma's smiths produce weapons of superior quality, daggers with perfectly balanced blades, spear points that hold an edge through repeated use, arrowheads designed to penetrate armor and flesh with equal efficiency. These are not decorative items but functional tools of warfare that give Kerma's soldiers concrete advantages in combat. Jewelry and personal adornment reach levels of artistry that speak to a society with leisure, wealth, and aesthetic sensibilities. Gold, abundant in the regions under Kerma's control, is worked into intricate designs, necklaces with precisely matched beads, earrings that showcase technical virtuosity, rings that combine different metals and materials into complex compositions. Semi-precious stones, carnelian, amethyst, turquoise, are imported from distant sources, cut and polished, incorporated into pieces that serve as both personal decoration and public statements of status. The social hierarchy became more pronounced during this era. At the apex stand the rulers, kings who command armies, who conduct diplomacy, who serve as focal points for the kingdom's identity and aspirations. Immediately below them exist a noble class, individuals who control land, who command retainers, who possess wealth sufficient to build substantial compounds and to be buried with grave goods that mark them as distinctly above common citizens. The priesthood constitutes its own hierarchy within the broader society, with senior priests wielding influence that sometimes rivals secular authorities. Merchants form another distinct class, their status derived not from birth or religious office, but from accumulated wealth and commercial success. In a society where trade is the lifeblood of prosperity, successful merchants command respect and influence. They negotiate with foreign traders, they organize caravans that venture into dangerous territories, they calculate risks and opportunities with the acumen that separates the wealthy from the bankrupt. Their homes fill with exotic goods from across the ancient world, Egyptian furniture, Mediterranean pottery, African artwork that speaks to the cosmopolitan nature of Kerma's elite culture. Below these elevated classes exist the craftspeople, potters, metal workers, weavers, leather workers, carpenters, whose skills produce the goods that drive trade and sustain daily life. These are not slaves or servants, but respected members of society whose expertise is valued, whose work is compensated, whose children can aspire to rise through demonstrated ability. Apprenticeship systems pass knowledge from generation to generation, ensuring that technical sophistication continues to advance rather than stagnate. Farmers form the broad base of the social pyramid. They work the fields that feed the city, they manage the irrigation systems that channel the Nile's floodwaters, they harvest the crops that are stored against lean times and exported to trading partners. Their lives are governed by the annual agricultural cycle, the inundation when the Nile floods and they wait for waters to recede, the planting season when every hand is needed in the fields, the growing season when crops must be tended and protected from pests and wildlife, the harvest when the year's labor is gathered and the cycle begins again. As the Middle Kingdom period progresses, the balance of power between Kerma and Egypt begins to shift in unexpected ways. Egyptian unity, never entirely secure, starts to fray under pressures both internal and external. Provincial governors accumulate power and begin to act more like independent rulers than loyal servants of the pharaoh. The bureaucracy that governs Egypt's complex irrigation systems and tax collection grows increasingly corrupt and inefficient. Military campaigns in the south drain resources without achieving decisive results. The signs of institutional decay multiply. Kerma's rulers observe these developments with keen interest. Intelligence flows north along the trade routes. Reports from merchants who witness political tensions in Egyptian cities, observations from spies who have cultivated relationships with discontented Egyptian officials, assessments from military scouts who note that Egypt's fortresses are not always fully garrisoned or properly maintained. This information is analyzed, debated in council chambers, incorporated into strategic planning that looks not just months but decades ahead. The strategy that emerges from these deliberations is patient and sophisticated. Rather than launching direct military challenges that would unite Egyptians against a common enemy, Kerma focuses on expanding its own power base while allowing Egyptian internal contradictions to do their destructive work. Resources that might have gone to military campaigns instead flow to strengthening trade networks, to enhancing Kerma's own administrative capacity, to building monuments that demonstrate the kingdom's permanence and power. The Eastern Defufa, a second massive temple complex, rises during this period. Its construction techniques show advances over the earlier Western Defufa, more refined brickwork, more sophisticated interior spaces, more deliberate integration with the surrounding urban landscape. The message is clear to anyone who witnesses these massive structures. Kerma is not a temporary phenomenon, but an enduring civilization capable of projects that span generations. The royal cemetery expands with increasingly elaborate tumuli. These are not simple grave mounds, but carefully engineered burial monuments that require months of labor by dozens of workers. The largest tumuli stretch more than 90 meters in diameter, their circular forms precisely laid out, their interiors designed as chambers where rulers are interred with everything needed for the afterlife journey. But the most striking and controversial aspect of these burials is what archaeologists would later discover: evidence of human sacrifice on a scale that speaks to beliefs about royal power that are alien to modern sensibilities. Hundreds of individuals are buried with the rulers in these massive tombs. They are not casualties of war or random victims, but carefully selected retainers, servants, guards, wives and attendants who are killed to accompany the ruler into the next world. The archaeological evidence suggests these deaths are ritualized, possibly conducted with the consent or even enthusiasm of the victims, who believe they are securing their own eternal futures by serving their Lord beyond death. Modern observers struggle to comprehend this practice, but within Kerma's religious worldview, it makes perfect sense. The ruler's power must continue in the afterlife, and that power requires the same apparatus of servants and supporters that sustained it in life. The grave goods that accompany these burials reveal the full extent of Kerma's wealth and international connections. Egyptian artifacts appear in abundance: fine pottery, carved stone vessels, furniture, and luxury items that demonstrate ongoing trade even during periods of political tension. African goods from the deep interior fill the chambers: ivory carved into intricate forms, ebony furniture inlaid with precious materials, gold jewelry that showcases technical mastery, and exotic animal remains that speak to the king's control over the natural world. Religious beliefs, while never fully recoverable from archaeological evidence alone, can be partially reconstructed from these burial practices. Kerma's worldview seems to emphasize continuity between life and death, the eternal nature of social hierarchies, and the sacred character of royal authority. The ruler is not simply a political leader, but a cosmic figure whose proper functioning ensures the Nile's flood, the success of harvests, the prosperity of the kingdom. When the ruler dies, reality itself is threatened, and elaborate rituals are required to restore cosmic balance and to ensure the smooth transition to the next reign. This religious ideology serves important political functions. It legitimizes royal authority as divinely ordained rather than merely human convention. It provides ideological justification for the concentration of wealth and power in royal hands. It creates social cohesion by giving everyone a place in a cosmic order that extends beyond the visible world into eternal realities. And it makes rebellion against the ruler not merely a political act but a violation of sacred order that threatens everyone's welfare. As Egypt's Middle Kingdom collapses into what historians call the Second Intermediate Period, Kerma enters its golden age. The pharaohs lose control of their own kingdom as Egypt fragments into competing power centers. In the Delta region, a group of Asiatic settlers known to history as the Hyksos established their own kingdom, introducing new military technologies including the war chariot and composite bow. In the south, Egyptian noble families maintained their own mini-kingdoms, nominally loyal to the weak pharaohs at Thebes but functionally independent. This Egyptian weakness creates unprecedented opportunities for Kerma. The chain of fortresses that once constrained Kerma's expansion northward are abandoned or fall into disrepair as Egypt lacks resources to maintain them. The trade routes that Egypt once controlled now become available for Kerma to dominate. Egyptian nobles, desperate for the luxury goods and resources that only Kerma can provide, negotiate from positions of weakness rather than strength. Kerma's rulers respond with a two-pronged strategy that demonstrates remarkable strategic sophistication. To the north, they expand military and political control, occupying Egyptian fortresses, establishing administrative control over territories that had been Egyptian, and forming alliances with Egyptian nobles who recognize that their interests are better served by cooperation with Kerma than by futile loyalty to the impotent pharaohs. To the south, they intensify trade relationships, drawing even more African wealth through their capital, positioning Kerma as the indispensable intermediary between the Mediterranean world and the African interior. The period archaeologists designate as Kerma Classique, the Classic Kingdom era, represents the apex of the civilization's power and cultural achievement. The capital city reaches its maximum extent, covering an area of nearly a square kilometer with a population that may have exceeded 10,000, enormous by ancient standards. The urban landscape shows clear zoning with distinct districts for different activities, religious centers around the defufas, administrative quarters where bureaucrats manage the kingdom's affairs, commercial districts where trade is conducted, residential areas organized by social status, and industrial zones where craftspeople produce goods for local use and export. The administrative apparatus that governs this expanding kingdom grows increasingly sophisticated. Written records remain frustratingly scarce. Kerma never developed its own writing system, or if it did, no examples have survived. But the organizational capacity required to manage the kingdom's affairs is evident from the material remains. Standardized weights and measures facilitate trade. Organized storage facilities hold tribute, trade goods, and emergency food supplies. Tax collection systems extract resources from the population while maintaining sufficient popular support to prevent rebellion. Diplomatic correspondence, likely conducted through Egyptian scribes employed by Kerma, maintains relationships with allies and rivals across the region. Military organization reaches new levels of effectiveness during this period. The army that once focused primarily on defense now becomes an instrument of expansion and power projection. Infantry forces combine archers, whose skills make them devastating in open combat, with spearmen who can hold positions and engage in close combat. Light cavalry or mounted scouts provide reconnaissance and harassment capabilities. Naval units control the Nile, the essential transportation corridor that connects the region and enables both trade and military operations. The military culture of Kerma emphasizes personal prowess and collective discipline in equal measure. Warriors train from youth, developing the strength and skill required for combat in an era when individual ability can determine battle outcomes. Archery especially receives intensive training. Boys learn to shoot at increasingly distant targets, to hit moving objects, to maintain accuracy while running or riding, to judge wind and distance instinctively. The legendary skill of Nubian archers, celebrated even in Egyptian sources, is not a natural gift, but the product of systematic training and martial culture. But individual warriors, however skilled, cannot win wars without organization. Kerma's military leaders understand unit cohesion, logistics, strategic positioning, and the countless practical details that separate victorious armies from defeated ones. Supply chains ensure that forces in the field receive food, water, replacement equipment, and reinforcements. Command structures clarify authority and enable coordinated action. Intelligence gathering provides information about enemy movements, strengths, and vulnerabilities. This is professional military activity conducted by a state that has learned to organize violence effectively. The expansion northward brings Kerma into direct administration of territories that had been Egyptian for centuries. This creates complex challenges. The local populations, ethnically and culturally Egyptian, must be governed in ways that prevent constant rebellion while extracting resources needed to sustain Kerma's power. The approach Kerma adopts shows considerable political sophistication. Rather than attempting to erase Egyptian identity or impose Kerma's culture by force, the rulers adopt a strategy of accommodation and co-optation. Local Egyptian elites who cooperate are allowed to maintain their positions and privileges. They continue to govern their districts, to collect taxes, to administer justice. But now they do so as representatives of Kerma's authority rather than the pharaohs. This system preserves social order while reducing the administrative burden on Kerma. It also creates a class of Egyptians whose interests align with Kerma's continued dominance, who become stakeholders in the system rather than resistors. Religious policies show similar flexibility. Kerma does not demand that Egyptian populations abandon their gods or adopt Kerma's religious practices. Egyptian temples continue to function, priests continue their rituals, the religious calendar continues its ancient patterns. What changes is the political narrative. These temples now offer prayers for Kerma's rulers rather than the pharaohs, acknowledge Kerma's authority as legitimate and divinely sanctioned, and teach congregations that prosperity comes through cooperation rather than resistance. This religious co-optation proves remarkably effective. In a world where religious authority and political power are inseparably intertwined, gaining the support or at least the acquiescence of the priesthood legitimizes rule in ways that military occupation alone cannot achieve. When priests proclaim that the gods favor Kerma's rule, when temple rituals acknowledge Kerma's kings, when religious festivals celebrate Kerma's victories, the population receives powerful messages that resistance is not merely futile, but actually impious. Trade during the Classic Kingdom period reaches volumes that make Kerma one of the wealthiest states in the ancient world. The gold mines under Kerma's control produce the precious metal that every ancient civilization craves for religious objects, royal regalia, and jewelry. The quantities flowing through Kerma are sufficient to supply not only local needs, but also to export to Egypt, to the Levant, possibly to the Mediterranean world beyond. This gold represents economic power but also political leverage. Those who want gold must maintain good relations with Kerma or do without. Ivory, from elephants hunted in the regions south of Kerma becomes another major trade commodity. The ancient world values ivory for carved objects, inlays, jewelry, and luxury items that signal wealth and status. The elephant herds that once ranged across much of northeastern Africa are being steadily depleted by hunting, making ivory increasingly valuable and making Kerma's control of the trade increasingly lucrative. Each tusk represents not just material value, but also the organizational capacity to mount hunting expeditions into dangerous territories, to transport heavy materials hundreds of miles, and to maintain relationships with the hunters who do the actual dangerous work. Ebony, aromatic resins, exotic animal skins, live animals for royal menageries, and enslaved people captured in wars or raids constitute additional trade goods. The ethics of this commerce, particularly the slave trade, are troubling to modern sensibilities. But in the ancient world, slavery is a universal institution. Victors in war enslave the defeated. Debtors unable to pay become slaves to creditors. Children born to enslaved parents inherit their status. Kerma's participation in this system is neither unusual nor, from ancient perspectives, morally questionable. It is simply how the world works. The wealth flowing through Kerma creates a golden age of cultural production. Artists working in multiple media produce objects of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. Sculptors carve stone and ivory into human and animal forms that capture movement and character with economy of line and attention to essential features. Painters decorate pottery and walls with geometric patterns and naturalistic images that demonstrate mastery of color, composition, and technique. Jewelers create pieces that combine precious metals and stones into wearable art that serves both aesthetic and symbolic functions. Music and dance, activities that leave little archaeological trace, but that are universal human practices, certainly flourish in this prosperous era. We can imagine musical instruments, drums, stringed instruments, wind instruments, producing rhythms and melodies that accompany religious ceremonies, royal celebrations, and popular entertainments. We can envision dancers performing intricate choreographed movements that tell stories, honor gods, celebrate victories, mourn losses. These performing arts, while lost to us except in fragmentary artistic representations, are as much part of Kerma's cultural achievement as the monuments and artifacts that survive. At the height of its power, Kerma faces the eternal challenge of successful states: how to maintain prosperity and stability when external circumstances are favorable, how to adapt when those circumstances inevitably change. The rulers of classic Kerma manage this challenge effectively for generations, but they cannot control developments beyond their borders, and those developments are about to transform the entire regional order. In Egypt, the weak pharaohs of the Second Intermediate Period finally produced a leader of exceptional ability and ambition. Ahmose I, ruling from Thebes, begins the process of reunifying Egypt under his authority. He waged successful campaigns against the Hyksos in the Delta, driving them from Egyptian territory and re-establishing indigenous control over the entire Nile Valley. This military success rejuvenates Egyptian confidence and provides Ahmose with the legitimacy and resources to look southward toward Kerma. The challenge Kerma represents to Egyptian restoration is both practical and symbolic. Practically, Kerma controls territories and trade routes that Egypt wants to reclaim. Symbolically, Kerma's independence and prosperity during Egypt's weakness is a standing rebuke to Egyptian pretensions of superiority and a reminder of failure that the newly reunified kingdom needs to erase. Ahmose and his successors view the conquest of Kerma as essential to Egypt's restoration as the preeminent power of the region. The new Egyptian dynasty, the 18th dynasty that inaugurates what historians call the New Kingdom, approaches the Kerma problem with resources and determination that the weak Middle Kingdom pharaohs could never muster. They command a reunified country with population and wealth far exceeding Kerma's. They possess new military technologies, including the chariot warfare they learned from their Hyksos enemies, that provide tactical advantages Kerma cannot easily counter. They harbor deep resentment of Kerma's previous expansion into Egyptian territory, a humiliation they are determined to avenge. Ahmose himself begins military operations against Kerma, but the conquest is completed by his successors, particularly Thutmose I, a pharaoh whose military abilities rival any in Egyptian history. The campaigns are methodical and brutal. Egyptian armies advance up the Nile, recapturing fortresses, defeating Kerma's forces in field battles, laying siege to defended positions, and systematically dismantling the military infrastructure that enabled Kerma's expansion. Kerma's military forces, formidable against Egyptian disunity, cannot withstand the focused power of a reunified Egypt. The strategic situation that favored Kerma for generations has reversed. Now, it is Egypt that possesses overwhelming advantages in population, resources, and military capacity. Kerma's asymmetric warfare tactics, effective for defense and raiding, prove insufficient when facing Egyptian armies that can absorb losses, maintain supply lines, and sustain campaigns season after season. The kingdom fights with courage and desperation, but courage cannot overcome structural disadvantages. One by one, Kerma's defensive positions fall. The territories gained during Egypt's weakness are recaptured. Egyptian forces push deeper into Nubia, advancing beyond the frontiers that the Middle Kingdom ever reached, determined not merely to defeat Kerma, but to ensure it can never threaten Egypt again. Thutmose I's campaign strikes at Kerma's heart. Egyptian armies reach the capital itself, the city that for 1,000 years has been the center of Nubian power and culture. The siege that follows is both a military operation and a symbolic act of dominance. When the city falls, the Egyptians do not simply occupy it. They methodically destroy it. The great tefufas are damaged and desecrated. The palace complex is burned. The residential districts are razed. The message is brutally clear. Kerma as an independent power is finished, erased as thoroughly as military victory can accomplish. The treatment of the conquered population follows patterns common in ancient warfare, but no less devastating for that familiarity. Large numbers are killed in the fighting or in the aftermath, as Egyptian forces eliminate potential resistance leaders. Others are enslaved and transported to Egypt, where they will labor on construction projects, in mines, on agricultural estates, their children born into servitude far from ancestral lands. The traditional elites who survive the conquest face a choice between collaboration with the conquerors or exile and dispossession. Many choose collaboration, preserving some vestige of status and wealth by serving Egyptian masters. The administrative structure that Egypt imposes on conquered Nubia is designed to prevent any revival of independent power. A viceroy bearing the title King's Son of Kush rules the region as a direct representative of the pharaoh. Military garrisons occupy strategic positions. Egyptian colonists settled in the conquered territories, displacing or mixing with the indigenous population, beginning a cultural transformation that will proceed over centuries. Temples dedicated to Egyptian gods are constructed, with priesthoods that teach Egyptian religious practices and cultural values to populations now expected to see themselves as subjects of Egypt rather than members of independent Nubian societies. The gold mines that once enriched Kerma now pour their wealth into Egyptian treasuries. The trade routes that Kerma controlled are now monopolized by Egyptian merchants operating under pharaonic authority. The artistic and cultural traditions that flourished in independent Kerma are either suppressed or transformed into provincial versions of Egyptian culture. The kingdom that existed for 1,000 years, that built monuments rivaling Egypt's own, that controlled vast territories and trade networks, effectively disappears from history. But empires, however thoroughly they may conquer, cannot entirely erase what preceded them. The population of Nubia, while now ruled by Egypt, retains memories and identities that resist complete assimilation. Cultural practices continue in modified forms. Languages persist despite official promotion of Egyptian. Kinship networks maintain continuity with the pre-conquest era. Resistance, while never again achieving the organized state-level opposition that Kerma represented, continues in forms ranging from passive non-cooperation to occasional open rebellion. The archaeological record of Kerma after the Egyptian conquest tells a story of cultural disruption and transformation. The great urban center that once bustled with trade and teemed with population gradually diminishes. Without political independence and the economic advantages that came from controlling trade routes, the city cannot sustain its former population. Buildings are abandoned. The grand structures decay as no one maintains them. Desert sand, patient and relentless, begins the process of burial that will continue for millennia. Egyptian colonial administration, while effective at extracting resources, shows little interest in preserving Kerma's cultural heritage. The Egyptians do not see themselves as custodians of Nubian civilization, but as civilizers bringing proper order to barbarous lands. Their inscriptions describe military campaigns in language that emphasizes Egyptian superiority and Nubian inferiority. Their artistic representations depict Nubians in stereotyped forms, darker-skinned, with exaggerated physical features, often shown as defeated enemies or humble tribute-bearers. This is not neutral administration but cultural imperialism that seeks to replace Nubian identity with Egyptian identity. Yet complete cultural erasure proves impossible. The basic geography that made Kerma strategically important, the position at the Third Cataract, the control of trade routes into interior Africa, remains unchanged. The population, while politically subjugated, retains distinctive characteristics that resist absorption into Egyptian identity. Language, kinship systems, religious practices, artistic traditions, and collective memories persist in forms that mix Egyptian influences with indigenous continuities. Over centuries of Egyptian rule, a hybrid culture emerges in Nubia. It is neither purely the ancient Kerma civilization nor simple replication of Egyptian culture, but something new, Egyptianized in many surface features, but maintaining Nubian characteristics in deeper structures. This cultural adaptation demonstrates the resilience of human communities even under oppressive circumstances. It also sets the stage for later historical developments when Egyptian control weakens and Nubian kingdoms will emerge again. Different from ancient Kerma, but still distinctly Nubian. The New Kingdom period of Egyptian history, from approximately 1550 to 1070 BCE, represents the era of most intense Egyptian control over Nubia. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses II launch campaigns that push Egyptian frontiers far to the south, well beyond the old Kerma territories. Egyptian temples proliferate across the region. Abu Simbel, with its massive rock-cut statues of Ramesses II, stands as the most spectacular, but is only one among many. These temples serve multiple functions: religious centers for Egyptian cults, administrative headquarters for colonial rule, propaganda installations proclaiming pharaonic power, and economic centers controlling local resources. The wealth extracted from Nubia during this period flows northward in quantities that help finance Egypt's golden age. The gold especially, mined by laborers working in brutal conditions, enables the grandeur associated with New Kingdom Egypt. The expansion of Karnak Temple, the construction of royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the luxury goods that fill elite burials, the diplomatic gifts that maintain Egypt's international relationships. In a very real sense, Nubian resources and Nubian labor underwrite Egyptian civilization's most celebrated era. But empires are not eternal. By the late New Kingdom, Egypt itself begins to experience the internal stresses and external pressures that eventually fragment all large states. The costs of maintaining far-flung territories and the military forces required to control them strain even Egypt's substantial resources. The priesthood of Amun accumulates wealth and power that rivals the pharaohs. The administrative apparatus becomes increasingly corrupt and inefficient. External threats emerge as migrations and invasions by groups collectively known as the Sea Peoples disrupt the entire eastern Mediterranean world. As Egyptian power contracts, space opens for Nubian autonomy to reassert itself. By approximately 170 BCE, effective Egyptian control over Upper Nubia had ended. Local rulers emerge who govern with increasing independence from nominal Egyptian overlords. These leaders operate in the cultural hybrid created. During centuries of Egyptian rule, they use Egyptian titles and artistic conventions. They worship gods from both Egyptian and indigenous Nubian pantheons. They write in Egyptian hieroglyphics because Nubian writing systems had been lost or suppressed. But they rule in Nubian interests and increasingly identify as Nubian rather than Egyptian. The kingdom of Kush, emerging around 800 BCE with its capital at Napata, represents this post-conquest Nubian revival. It is not simply a restoration of ancient Kerma. Too much time has passed, too much has changed, but it draws on the memory and legacy of Kerma as proof that Nubians can create powerful civilizations. The Kushite rulers initially present themselves as more authentically Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves, claiming to preserve traditional religious practices and cultural values that Egypt proper has corrupted. This ideological positioning allows them to intervene in Egyptian politics as restorers rather than conquerors. The Kushite conquest of Egypt itself, achieved by rulers like Pa and Shabaka around 750 to 700 BCE, represents one of history's great reversals. The descendants of the people whom Egypt conquered and colonized now rule Egypt as the 25th dynasty. They govern from Thebes, they are recognized as legitimate pharaohs, they conduct themselves according to Egyptian royal traditions, but they are unmistakably Nubian. This period of Kushite rule over Egypt, though lasting only about 60 years before Assyrian invasions drove them back to Nubia, demonstrates that the conquest of Kerma had not destroyed Nubian capacity for state-building and military power. Yet even as Kushite kingdoms maintain Nubian independence and occasionally dominate Egypt for centuries after Kerma's fall, the ancient kingdom itself slides into obscurity and then into oblivion. The Kushite rulers at Napata and later at Meroe are aware of earlier Nubian civilizations, but the specific knowledge of Kerma fades. The Great. Monuments are buried under sand. The city becomes ruins that nomads and travelers pass without recognizing their significance. The very name Kerma is forgotten, replaced in historical consciousness by more recent kingdoms. For 3,000 years, the ruins of Kerma lie buried beneath Sudanese sands, their secrets preserved by the very forces that destroyed the visible traces. The occasional traveler might notice the strange mounds that rise from the desert floor, might wonder briefly about their origins, but without excavation, the ruins reveal nothing. Local populations transmit no oral traditions explaining these enigmatic formations. The classical authors who wrote about Egypt and Nubia make no mention of ancient Kerma. The medieval Arab geographers who traveled through the region record no traditions about the vanished kingdom. It is as though civilization had never existed. The rediscovery begins in the late 19th century when European colonial expansion brings archaeologists and adventurers to Sudan. George Reisner, an American archaeologist working in the region in the 1910s and 1920s, begins systematic excavations at the site. What he uncovers astonishes the scholarly world, a major civilization previously unknown that had existed alongside ancient Egypt and had been substantial enough to construct massive monuments, support sophisticated urban life, and accumulate wealth on a scale that rivals the pharaonic kingdoms. Reisner's excavations reveal the Dephafas, their massive mud brick structures still standing despite 3 millennia of abandonment. He uncovers the royal cemetery with its enormous tumuli and the disturbing evidence of mass human sacrifice. He finds the pottery that would become Kerma's most recognizable artifact, those impossibly thin vessels with their distinctive coloring achieved through techniques that modern potters struggle to replicate. He documents urban layouts, fortification systems, and artifact assemblages that speak to international trade connections spanning Africa and the Mediterranean world. The scholarly debates that follow Reisner's discoveries illuminate the biases and assumptions that shaped early 20th century archaeology. Reisner himself, operating from premises that assumed African civilizations were primitive compared to Mediterranean ones, initially interprets Kerma as an Egyptian colonial outpost rather than an independent kingdom. This interpretation, though eventually disproven by subsequent research, reflects the difficulty European and American scholars had accepted that sophisticated civilizations had existed in sub-Saharan Africa before colonial contact. Only gradually, as more evidence accumulates and as African archaeology develops more sophisticated interpretive frameworks, does the true nature of Kerma become clear. This is not an Egyptian colony. This is an independent African civilization that developed its own distinctive culture, that built monuments according to its own architectural principles, that organized society in ways that reflected its own values rather than Egyptian models, and that competed successfully with Egypt for regional dominance for nearly 1,000 years. The chronology that emerges from archaeological research divides Kerma's history into phases that track the kingdom's rise, florescence, and fall. The early Kerma period, from approximately 2500 to 2050 BCE, sees the initial development of urban life and the establishment of trade networks. The Middle Kerma period, from about 2050 to 1750 BCE, witnessed expansion and the construction of the Great Dephufas. The Classic Kerma period, from roughly 1750 to 1500 BCE, represents the kingdom's apex during Egypt's Second Intermediate period. The final phase, ending around 1450 BCE, marks the Egyptian conquest and the end of Kerma as an independent state. The pottery sequence, studied in minute detail by specialists, provides a relative chronology that allows precise dating of sites and artifacts. The evolution of pottery styles follows clear developmental patterns, increasing technical sophistication, refinement of decorative techniques, standardization of forms for different functions. This mundane material, sherds scattered across ancient sites, becomes a powerful tool for reconstructing historical sequences and cultural relationships. The controversy over the human sacrifices continues to generate scholarly debate and popular fascination. The evidence is unambiguous. Hundreds of individuals were killed and buried with rulers in ceremonies that required substantial organization and deeply held beliefs about royal authority and the afterlife. But the interpretation of this evidence remains contested. Were the sacrificed victims willing participants in religious ceremonies they believed essential for cosmic order? Were they coerced? Were they enslaved people whose lives were considered expendable? The archaeological evidence cannot answer these questions definitively, leaving room for multiple interpretations. Modern scholarship increasingly emphasizes Kerma's agency and sophistication, rather than viewing the kingdom as a simple or primitive society that succeeded only when Egypt was weak. Contemporary historians recognize Kerma as a complex civilization that made strategic choices, that adapted to changing circumstances, that developed distinctive cultural forms, and that achieved impressive accomplishments by any reasonable standard. The tendency to measure African civilizations, primarily by comparison to Egyptian ones, is recognized as a form of bias that distorts understanding. The question of Kerma's legacy becomes central to assessing the kingdom's historical significance. In one sense, the legacy seems minimal. The kingdom was conquered, its cities destroyed, its political institutions eliminated, even its name forgotten for 3 millennia. But in another sense, the legacy is profound. Kerma demonstrates that sophisticated urban civilizations, developed in sub-Saharan Africa thousands of years before European contact. It proves that African societies created monumental architecture, organized complex states, participated in international trade networks, and produced artistic traditions of great sophistication. This knowledge matters. For too long, European and American scholarship operated from assumptions that civilization was essentially a Mediterranean and Middle Eastern phenomenon, that sub-Saharan Africa remained primitive until contact with external civilizers. These assumptions justified colonialism, rationalized racial hierarchies, and distorted global history. The archaeological recovery of Kerma and of many other African civilizations demolishes these assumptions and demands radical revision of historical narratives. The physical remains of Kerma, carefully excavated and studied by multiple generations of archaeologists, now reside in museums around the world. The Sudan National Museum in Khartoum houses the largest collection, including many of the finest pottery vessels, jewelry, and other artifacts. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where George Reisner deposited much of his excavated material, contains another major collection. These museum displays introduce millions of visitors to a civilization most have never heard of, slowly expanding public awareness beyond the specialist, scholarly community. The interpretation of Kerma continues to evolve as new excavations reveal additional evidence and as theoretical approaches in archaeology become more sophisticated. Recent work emphasizes the importance of indigenous African perspectives in understanding African civilizations, challenging the dominance of frameworks developed by and for European and American scholars. This methodological shift has profound implications for how we understand not just Kerma, but the entire trajectory of African history. One significant area of ongoing research concerns Kerma's relationship with regions south and east of the kingdom. The trade networks that brought gold, ivory, and exotic goods to Kerma's markets extended deep into the African interior, connecting with societies about which we know very little. Were these relationships purely commercial, or did they involve cultural exchange, political alliances, and population movements? As archaeological investigation extends into regions that remain understudied, we are beginning to see glimpses of a broader world in which Kerma played a central role, but which extended far beyond the kingdom's immediate territories. The question of literacy at Kerma remains unresolved and tantalizing. We have no definitive evidence that Kerma developed its own writing system, yet the administrative and commercial complexity of the kingdom seems to demand some form of record-keeping beyond what memory and oral tradition could support. Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions appear in Kerma, mostly on imported Egyptian objects or on monuments created after the conquest, But these tell us more about Egyptian perspectives on Nubia than about Kerma itself. Did Kerma use a writing system that has simply not survived in the archaeological record? Did it employ foreign scribes who wrote in Egyptian or other languages? Or did it manage sophisticated administration through non-written systems of accounting and record-keeping? We do not yet know, and each answer would have significant implications for understanding the kingdom's organization. The religious beliefs and practices of Kerma, while partially reconstructible from burial evidence and temple remains, remain frustratingly opaque in their details. We can see that the society had complex beliefs about the afterlife, that rulers occupied positions of religious as well as political significance, that human sacrifice played some role in royal ideology, but the specific mythologies, the names and characteristics of deities, the theological frameworks that gave these practices meaning, all this remains largely unknown. This is one of the great losses of Kerma's conquest and the subsequent erasure of its traditions. We have the physical remains of religious practice, but lack access to the meanings those practices held for believers. Modern Sudan, the nation-state that encompasses ancient Kerma's territories, has complex relationships with this heritage. On one hand, Kerma represents a powerful symbol of African civilization and national pride, proof that the region has a history of greatness independent of Arab, Egyptian, or European influences. On the other hand, contemporary Sudanese identity is shaped by many forces: Arab culture, Islam, more recent kingdoms like Funj and the Mahdist state, and the traumatic experiences of colonialism and post-colonial conflicts. Integrating ancient Nubian heritage into national consciousness when many citizens identify primarily with cultures that arrived much later is an ongoing negotiation. The archaeological sites themselves face multiple threats. Looting by treasure hunters seeking artifacts for the international antiquities market has damaged some sites irreparably. Agricultural expansion and urban growth threaten others. Dam construction along the Nile, while providing needed electricity and water management, has flooded some ancient sites and threatens others. Climate change and desertification alter the conditions that preserved sites for millennia. International cooperation to document and protect these heritage sites continues, but resources are limited and the challenges are substantial. The parallels between Kerma's historical experience and broader patterns in African history are striking. The cycle of indigenous state formation, foreign conquest, cultural resilience under colonial rule, and eventual reassertion of independent identity reappears throughout African history from ancient times to the present. Kerma's story is in many ways a template for understanding how African civilizations have navigated relationships with more powerful external forces, while maintaining distinctive identities even in circumstances of severe oppression. The question of how to remember and commemorate Kerma raises interesting issues about historical memory and contemporary politics. Should the emphasis be on Kerma's achievements and sophistication, celebrating an African civilization that rivaled ancient Egypt? Should it focus on the tragedy of conquest and cultural erasure, highlighting the violence and loss inherent in imperial expansion? Should it emphasize cultural resilience and continuity, showing how Nubian identity persisted despite centuries of foreign rule? Each framing serves different purposes and appeals to different audiences, and all contain elements of truth. Educational curricula in Sudan and internationally increasingly include information about Kerma and other ancient African civilizations. This is a significant shift from earlier educational approaches that treated African history as beginning with European contact, or that relegated African civilizations to footnotes in courses focused primarily on European and Middle Eastern history. Students learning about Kerma encounter a different narrative about Africa, one that centers African agency, achievement, and historical depth. The artistic legacy of Kerma, particularly the pottery tradition, continues to inspire contemporary African artists. The distinctive forms and decorative techniques have been studied, adapted, and reinterpreted by modern ceramicists seeking to connect with African cultural heritage. This creative engagement with ancient traditions represents a form of cultural continuity, a dialogue across millennia between artists working in similar materials and facing similar technical challenges, separated by time but connected by craft. For historians of ancient Africa, Kerma represents both what we have achieved in understanding the continent's past and how much remains unknown. A civilization that was completely forgotten has been recovered through archaeological research, demonstrating the power of careful excavation and analysis to reconstruct vanished worlds. Yet massive gaps remain in our knowledge. We have physical remains but limited access to the beliefs, emotions, daily experiences, and specific events that made up life in ancient Kerma. This tension between what we know and what we cannot know animates ongoing research. The broader implications of Kerma's story extend beyond academic history into contemporary questions about identity, power, and historical consciousness. In a world where historical narratives have been systematically distorted to justify racial hierarchies and colonial domination, the recovery of civilizations like Kerma becomes a political act as well as a scholarly one. It challenges narratives that denied Africa's historical agency. It provides concrete evidence that sophisticated civilizations developed in Africa independently of external influence. It demonstrates that the African past is far richer and more complex than colonial-era narratives acknowledged. The erasure of Kerma from history, the physical destruction of its cities, the suppression of its cultural traditions, the loss even of its name, stands as a cautionary tale about the fragility of historical memory. If a kingdom that lasted 1,000 years, that built massive monuments, that controlled vast territories and accumulated substantial wealth, could disappear so completely from human consciousness, what other civilizations have vanished without trace? How many histories have been lost irretrievably? The questions haunt anyone who contemplates Kerma's rediscovery. Yet the story is not entirely one of loss. The archaeological recovery of Kerma demonstrates human capacity to reconstruct past worlds from fragmentary evidence. Through patient excavation, careful analysis, and creative interpretation, scholars have resurrected a civilization from beneath desert sands. This is a different kind of immortality than the builders of the Defufas imagined, but it is immortality nonetheless. 3,000 years after its fall, Kerma lives again in museums, in scholarly publications, in educational curricula, and in the historical consciousness of millions who now know that Africa's first kingdom existed and mattered. The lessons of Kerma extend beyond the specific historical narrative to broader questions about how societies navigate challenges. The kingdom thrived for centuries by adapting to changing circumstances, by building strategic relationships, by maintaining flexibility in the face of external pressures. When those strategies finally failed against overwhelming Egyptian military power, the conquest seemed to erase Kerma completely. But the deeper patterns, the capacity for social organization, the cultural creativity, the strategic thinking, these did not disappear. They re-emerged in later Nubian kingdoms, demonstrating that cultural traditions possess resilience that survives even catastrophic defeats. For contemporary audiences, particularly those of African descent seeking to understand their ancestral heritage, Kerma offers a powerful counter-narrative to stories of African inferiority and passivity. Here is concrete evidence of African achievement, of civilization building that predates European empires by millennia, of sophisticated societies that created beauty, accumulated knowledge, organized complex institutions, and left permanent marks on history. This knowledge does not erase the traumas of slavery, colonialism, and racism, but it provides a foundation for identity that emphasizes agency and achievement rather than victimization. The international scholarly community that studies Kerma reflects the globalization of archaeology and history. Sudanese scholars work alongside European, American, and colleagues from around the world, bringing diverse perspectives to interpretation of evidence. This collaboration, when conducted equitably, enriches understanding by challenging any single culture's assumptions about the past. It also raises important questions about who owns ancient heritage, the nation-state that contains archaeological sites, the descendants of ancient populations, humanity as a whole, or some combination of these constituencies. As archaeological techniques continue to advance, new methods reveal information that earlier excavations could not access. Remote sensing technologies identify buried structures without excavation. Chemical analyses of residues reveal what ancient people ate and drank. DNA studies of skeletal remains illuminate population relationships and migrations. Isotope analysis traces the geographic origins of individuals and trade goods. Each technical advance adds layers of detail to our understanding of Kerma, filling gaps and sometimes challenging earlier interpretations. The future of Kerma studies looks promising. Multiple excavation projects continue to work in the region. Museum exhibitions bring Kerma's story to broader audiences. Academic publications refine our understanding of specific aspects of civilization. Popular books and documentaries make the story accessible beyond specialist circles. Digital archives preserve excavation records and artifact photographs for future researchers. All of this activity ensures that Kerma, forgotten for 3 millennia, will not fade from consciousness again. Yet challenges remain. The political instability that has plagued Sudan in recent decades threatens archaeological work and heritage preservation. International funding for research in Africa remains inadequate compared to the importance and potential of the subject. The legacy of colonial-era scholarship, with its biases and distortions, continues to influence interpretation in subtle ways. Addressing these challenges requires sustained commitment from multiple stakeholders: governments, universities, museums, funding agencies, and the general public. The story of Kerma ultimately is a story about the human capacity for creation and the inevitability of change. A people, in a specific place at a specific time, built something remarkable, a civilization that endured for a millennium, that produced art of enduring beauty, that organized itself into a powerful state, that participated in the grand currents of ancient history. That civilization fell to stronger forces, as all civilizations eventually do. But its legacy, rediscovered after millennia of silence, now enriches human understanding of our collective past. The ruins that rise from the Sudanese desert, the artifacts in museum cases, the scholarly articles and books, the educational programs, the continuing excavations, all of these are monuments to Kerma's persistence through time. The kingdom that vanished has returned, not as a political entity, but as a presence in historical consciousness, as evidence of what Africans achieved, as a chapter in the human story that can no longer be ignored or dismissed. For those who believe that history matters, that understanding the past illuminates the present, that every human civilization deserves recognition and study regardless of its contemporary power, Kerma stands as validation. Africa's first kingdom, lost to memory for 3,000 years, has been found. Its story, once silenced, now speaks across the centuries. The desert that buried Kerma's cities has finally released its secrets, and those secrets tell a tale of human ambition, achievement, adaptation, and the eternal struggle to create meaning and leave marks that endure beyond any individual life. This is the legacy of Kerma, not just the physical ruins and artifacts, but the knowledge that Africans built great civilizations long before the modern era, that these civilizations were sophisticated and powerful, that their erasure from history was an act of violence that we can now partially undo through scholarship and memory. In remembering Kerma, we recover a piece of human heritage that belongs to everyone, but especially to those whose ancestors built the mud brick temples, fired the impossibly thin pottery, controlled the gold trade, and believed their kingdom would endure forever. They were wrong about eternity, but they were right about significance. Kerma mattered then, it matters now, and it will continue to matter as long as humans care about understanding where we came from, what we achieved, and how the past shapes possibilities for the future.